I Hate the News is the weekly news bulletin from I Hate Politics podcast, a show about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. It's February 11th, 2025. Maryland Governor Westmore presented his State of the State address last week. The Republican response was predictable but also has found resonance in some local governments. We have numbers on the impact of the governor's proposals from Prince George's County Budget Director Stanley Early. A University of Maryland Washington Post poll finds that the governor remains popular but lacks support for some of his proposals. Affordable housing is now the top political issue in the state. Is it a double-edged sword? Midterm personnel changes are common, and we will look at a handful. And more. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program. If your goal is to make a meaningful impact with a career in local, state, or federal government, discover what this degree can do for you. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from the 1920s. Song recordings and films from a century ago just entered the public domain this January. First up, Tea for Two by the Benson Orchestra of Chicago. Maryland Governor Westmore delivered his 2025 State of the State address at the State House in Annapolis on February 5th. 3 weeks ago, the governor presented a budget addressing the state's structural deficit, adding $1.4 billion in new taxes and cutting $2 billion in expenses. We've covered the budget details in several episodes with sitting General Assembly members if you are looking for them. The governor has argued that his budget cuts are judicious and his tax increases necessary and fair. He has emphasized economic growth as the way to bring the state out of its current slump. But he has also said that he was left an economic slowdown by his predecessor, Larry Hogan, which is the cause for the fiscal crisis today, and that the future of federal support under the Trump administration is uncertain.
We've already collectively made real progress in just the last 2 years. Together, we have created nearly 100,000 Maryland jobs. That together, we have connected over 100,000 Marylanders to broadband for the first time. That together we have provided childcare to 16,000 additional Maryland children. That together we raised the minimum wage and made sure our people can be paid fairly for their work and for their labor. Together, we brought the unemployment rate down from being 43rd in the nation when we took office to now being one of the lowest rates in the entire country. And we have seen women's labor force participation increase by more than almost any other state in America. Together, we are breaking the back of violent crime, and according to preliminary data, homicides and non-fatal shootings are the lowest they have been statewide in a decade. Today, Maryland is safer and more competitive than what it was 2 years ago. But there is still a lot of work to do. We've identified 3 lighthouse industries that we have got to build out: IT, aerospace and defense, and life sciences. I want Maryland to be the capital of quantum and AI and clean energy and biotech. And I want to make sure that all the sectors that will define the economies of tomorrow will be housed right here in the state of Maryland. Commerce and trade are the bedrock of our state. And that is why this year we have proposed new funding for a transformative project at Trade Point Atlantic. This work is going to increase the Port of Baltimore's container capacity by 70%, create more than 8,000 jobs, and generate $1 billion of private investment.
He was speaking to Democratic supermajorities in both the House and the Senate, who are sympathetic to his view of the past and the future. House Minority Leader, Republican Jason Buckle of Allegheny County, provided the response.
Governor Moore claims his budget is a pragmatic mix of tax cuts for the middle class, tax increases for only the wealthiest Marylanders, and real spending reductions. However, Governor Moore's spending cuts are not what they appear to be. The largest cut in Governor Moore's budget is not a cut at all, but merely a decision not to put $420 million into the Rainy Day Fund, our state's savings account. He also shifts $145 million of spending onto the backs of local governments, who will, as a result, likely be enforced to increase local taxes. The truth is, we are spending more on education, more on healthcare, more on mass transit, and more on state government employee costs than last year. When it comes to taxation, the governor's budget merely gives with one hand while taking with the other, and he is taking far more than he gives. Where he modestly cuts income taxes for the middle class, reducing their tax rate by less than 1/10 of a percentage point, he also eliminates itemization of deductions, such as interest on your home mortgage, causing many middle-class taxpayers to pay more. His elimination of the vehicle trade-in allowance will increase taxes on most new car purchases by an average of $1,200. He seeks, for the first time, a fee on the delivery of any product, like pizza or your Amazon order, which will cost many Maryland families hundreds of dollars a year in new taxes. There is a repeated refrain from Maryland's Democratic leaders that this year's deficit is not caused by the massive education spending program known as the Blueprint, because it is fully funded. That is, at best, a disingenuous position. What they mean is this year, the Blueprint Fund covers the costs of the Blueprint, and no additional monies from other state government funds will be needed to cover the costs. What they choose to ignore is that the dollars in the Blueprint Fund represent Maryland's tax monies previously spent in other areas of government that are now being used exclusively to fund the Blueprint. This includes 12% of the state's total sales tax revenue, and in total, this year alone, the Blueprint Fund includes about $1 billion in revenue that used to be available for things like healthcare, economic development, public safety, and our infrastructure needs. Put another way, if we simply use the alleged Blueprint Fund to pay for our state government's other ongoing obligations, there would be no real need for the $1 billion in tax hikes Governor Moore is requesting.
Delegate Buckle's speech may be the usual response from an opposition party, but if you listen carefully, there is some resonance in the comments coming out of Maryland counties. This is Stanley Early, budget director for Prince George's County, where the Republican Party is not strong. Director Early is making a presentation to the county council. The audio in this segment is low. You may like to turn up the volume.
We have modified that chart based on what's happened with the governor's budget. That gap that was like $120 million is now like $170 million. It's the size of the gap that we've been working with, understanding the state had serious problems, and I'm not disputing that at all. One of the things that the budget does is it's phasing out over a couple of years the supplemental tax retirement grant that comes to the county. Now that was $9.6 million in this year, and half of it would go away next year. Another item, historically, we have paid 50% of the cost for SDAT, as has every other county. The budget changes that to 90%.
SDAT is the State Department of Assessments and Taxation, which is the state agency responsible for assessments across the state.
In addition, on the supplemental retirement costs, the other side of that is it reduces the amount the state is paying for community college and Board of Education teachers' retirement. That's going to cost us another $13 million in 2026. There was revised information from the state on how much we'll have to pay for the blueprint. There's about $21 million of additional items for the governor's budget, that additional costs from the governor's budget that we will have to spend. So we are required by state law to spend about $80 million more on the school system next year than we did this year. Our total additional revenue is $51 million. So before we start with everything else, we got a problem. This puts us in a more difficult situation. We don't want to lose our bond rating, our AAA bond rating. That would increase our costs and also make us less competitive in certain kinds of economic development situations. So we already have a warning, which is to say we have a negative outlook from, I believe it's Moody's.
We will keep digging into the implications of the state budget, including hopefully next week, breaking down a report from the Board of Revenue Estimates on the impact of the governor's proposal to do away with itemized deductions on state income tax returns in favor of standard deductions. But how is all this being received? The University of Maryland's Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement and the Washington Post released a new poll. Mike Hanmer is a political science professor at Maryland and the director of the center.
Overall, Governor Moore has retained pretty strong support. That said, we looked at a number of the policies proposed to deal with the budget deficit, and it's a mixed bag. I think one of the things that we're seeing time and time again is that young people are pretty interesting. A majority of them, 18 to 29, supported taxing people with incomes over $500,000, but they were 10 points behind people age 65 and above. That's a pretty big gap when at least a lot of the 18 to 29-year-olds I'm familiar with aren't really all that close to being in that tax bracket. Similarly, they were lower on taxing sports betting, cannabis. Those make a little bit more sense, I think, when you start to think about use of those things.
Overall, though, the appetite for sin taxes is almost as high as the appetite for taxing the rich.
I think that's what we're seeing here. On the other side, the proposed fee for deliveries, from major corporations, that's going to hit so many more people that you sort of expect that one to be a potential concern.
What struck me also was the fact that the governor is moving forward with the delivery charge, which is unpopular, but he has backed off from the idea of putting beer and wine in grocery stores, which is a tremendously popular idea.
That one does stand out if it doesn't go forward.
Affordable housing is now the number one political issue. Housing has been unaffordable in Maryland for quite some time, maybe for a decade long. But it is only now that it is the number one issue, according to your poll. I am wondering if this is a artifact of the governor himself making an issue out of affordable housing and putting it on the front burner.
Yeah, so I think it could be multiple things. I think absolutely the more attention that's being brought to it is going to start to shift the way people are thinking. The other side of this is that concerns with crime have really come down. But I understand from some conversations with colleagues who study crime that what the poll is picking up is that in many areas crime is down.
With crime, there's a lag, right, between when crime started to drop and when it became reflected in public opinion.
Sure.
But if you look at housing, what is interesting about that is that housing has been a huge problem for the last 10 years. Which of your polls started to show affordable housing as the number one issue?
Housing was third in 2019. And then in one of the polls we did in 2024, it was second. And what we see is an uptick from 2024 on housing, not that large, but a really big drop on crime. In our 2024 survey, over 30% said that was the biggest problem, and that dropped now to under 20%.
I was thinking that something like affordable housing, on which the governor has some control but not terrible control, right? It's hugely about local ordinances, it's about financing, it's about all kinds of other things. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because you make something like that a top issue, you bring it front and center, and then people expect you to solve it.
I think that's right. And I think you're right to say that it's really complicated. And some of that complication really has to do with things that are beyond the governor's control.
You had some comparison numbers between Governor Moore and his predecessors. How do those map?
Larry Hogan still, I think, stands out. His numbers haven't quite gotten to where Hogan's best numbers were. But again, the times and the circumstances, all of those things are very different.
Yeah, the looming shadow of Larry Hogan has haunted Governor Moore ever since. And, I would imagine some of these tax reforms and others would have come last year were it not for that legacy.
Think back to, the messaging about the rain tax. That's just very simple and very easy for anybody to not like, and not have to worry about going into the details. Now, again, we want citizens to go through the details and all of those things, but people have complicated lives themselves. We know that most people are not sitting around thinking about the details of every policy proposal. But if you get tagged with something like rain tax, it's going to be tough.
Mike Hamner, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care.
It's midterm for Governor Moore, and that often means personnel changes. He is hiring two former Biden officials, Harry Coker, who used to be a cybersecurity chief in the federal government, to be the state's commerce secretary, and replacing Laura Herrera Scott as health secretary with Meena Sheshamani from the Federal Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Last December, former Montgomery County Delegate Eric Lutke stepped down as the governor's chief legislative officer and was replaced by Jeremy Baker, who used to be the chief of staff to Maryland House Speaker Adrian Jones. Lutke remains a senior advisor to Moore. That's all for this episode. Be sure to check out our feature interview series that come out Friday mornings. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with support from University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from the newly in public domain tunes from the 1920s. We heard the Paul Whiteman Band, their work, I Will See You in My Dreams, and Carl Fenton's Limehouse Blues. Those were within the episode. And now we go out with Jan Garber with the number I Want to Be Happy. Who can argue with that? Usually we feature local music on the show. If you want to share your music on the podcast or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. See you next time.